Eh bien, bonjour mesdames, messieurs. Je m'excuse, je vais parler en anglais parce que c'est ma première langue. Mais si il y a les questions plus tard, je vais essayer en français aussi. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a beautiful day, a nice large auditorium, and what I would consider a small tutorial group meeting. So I'm probably going to diverge a little bit from the topic, but a little bit aware of the time. When Two Worlds Collide is clearly the sort of title that I came up with before last month, and it refers really to what I consider a much bigger issue that's going on behind the scenes in our world, which has changed a lot over the last 30 years or so. I should first say who I am. Simon Grange. I'm a senior consultant orthopedic surgeon, mainly shoulders and trauma. Currently working in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. I ran the shoulder service for the military there for about 7 years and stayed out there. And now what I'm doing is trying to tie that back into working with the continent, because I was involved in Framework Program 5 and Framework Program 7 for orthopedic research, working with wonderful colleagues in France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Sweden, Hungary, a few more places as well along the way. So I'm coming to this, hopefully, as I used to say, as someone born in England with a British passport, European citizenship, till that went wrong, and a global outlook. So who is this talk for? Ostensibly everyone. And the reason I say everyone is because I grew up in the era of Monty Python, which I'm looking at the audience, probably there's one person. Hello, great. There was this wonderful quote at one point, which, he's talking to this crowd of people who think that he knows everything and that can give them the answers. And he says, no, you're individuals. You have to be individuals. Yes, we're all individuals. No, you're different. And yes, we're all different. And one guy goes, I'm not. I don't know, it just cracked me up at the time. And maybe it's trying to set some sort of segue in some context for what really matters, because we are all individuals. You've got a 1 in 4 trillion chance of existing as who you are genetically. That's a pretty small chance. So trust me, there's never going to be another you. Well, unless we get the cloning. Anyway, but that aside, I'm aware I'm being recorded. So the point I'm making is we're going to do who, what, where, when, why, how, because that's the easiest way to break through a subject in different languages. My interest has become more and more medical data. They say you start your career as an orthopedic surgeon, you end it as a plastic surgeon. So technically I'm orthoplastics. A lot of the stuff is, I enjoy the fine stuff, I enjoy the detail. Ironically, skills I learned as a child painting the little soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars, which I know Belgium hosted quite a few of those. So from what I'm dealing with today, medical data is becoming the big driving point, and the role of AI in that. I am sure AI gets bandied around everywhere. If you haven't got AI in it, have you got electricity? It's just become the new norm. Having said that, the exponential rate of progress, and I've just been in a 2-day meeting in London on AI specifically in orthopedics, you start to really see how, this is no longer something which is a novelty. So a lot of this is not just about how we're bringing these tools into the background and how the Odoo platform is a way of integrating these other services, which we've been doing, but also the potential fundamental changes that we'd like to see as a result of that. So I'm going to just mention the 5 Ps. What are the 5 Ps? The argument is that medicine should be personalized. It's not one size fits all anymore. It's not you're going to the hospital. It's about how these people are providing services specifically for you. It should be predictive. Okay, well, that's forecasting, that's AI in a nutshell. It should be preventative. So by that, what we mean is that we're picking things up early, because literally a stitch in time saves 9. I spend a lot of my time repairing shoulders, and if I get a tear in a tendon, I can fix it with 1 stitch. 2 years later, it might literally take 9 stitches. So we want to get on top of the problems before they become big problems and harder to treat. Participatory. At the moment I'm talking to you, but it really should be a dialogue. And that's how I tend to run my clinics, that's how I tend to work with people, and that's why I sleep at night, is because, I'm trying to do what they want me to do rather than what, I'm meant to be forcing on things. And then populational. I work a lot about life science scale. I'll talk about that in a moment. The life science scale basically is sort of genome, proteome, metabolome, up through cells, tissues, organs, the individual. And then you got, 1, 2, 7, 15, 150 for normal population sizes, and then we just go a log scale up through, so like it's probably 1,000 people in the building where I live. There's probably 10,000 on that island, and there's probably 100,000 in that district, and 1 million in the city, etc. Right up through to the 10 to the 10 that we're rapidly heading towards at the end of this century. So if you think about where these interact with each other, and the multimodal modeling becomes very important. So now a slight change of gear. I'm sure you've heard of blockchain, and the fact that 97% of cryptos were basically scams. And so I'll come onto the Gartner curve in a minute. It's not exactly in a good place on the Gartner curve at the moment. However, technologically, linked lists have been around since about 1972 in computing. So it's not a new concept. It's been around 50 years. It's just how we actually set it in context and use it properly. The fundamental point of this is that from the user, they can get attestation, they can get proof of identity, proof of verifications from different organizations and entities. And it brings them back to being the center of their data, and that's the key for this. And I don't particularly think it's worth going too much into the detail, but when you're dealing with personalized medicine, obviously the first thing is we've got to work out who somebody is. They usually have a unique identifier, which makes it a lot easier in most developed countries. The question is, what do you hang on that unique identifier? And so a lot of the way I see this is similar to the KYC AML question that you'll get with you're working with banks, etc. I'm sure there's plenty of tools that people will like to push towards you down in the main hall there. But it's fundamental. We can't escape the fact that something like 16% of the world's economy is not exactly legitimate. So the rest of us have to actually find rules to play by to make it fair. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ERC 725 in a minute. Question then, why? When? Is we've probably got about 18 months left. The reason I say that is that the very large companies with their large language models are basically vacuuming up most of the markets and the different systems that are out there. However, as we saw with COVID, a lot of healthcare systems have been run down to the bone. They are basically, let's make things cheaper, faster, leaner. And ironically, biology learned that wasn't such a good idea along the way. So we tend to build in redundancy, we build in diversity, and we have modularity, especially with things like our immune system. If you had to sort of die every time you got a cold, you wouldn't really move forward. So what we do is we produce millions and millions of different antibodies that are basically a waste of time, 99.99% of the time. But that other 0.01%, they are really useful, and that's why we're all sat here today. So you have to have adaptation, you have to have some prudence, i.e. you have to be anticipating the risks and risk mitigation. And then we have to be embedding systems. And again, that's one of the appeals of Odoo. I mean, I spent something like 5 years working on building different types of platforms as a service. Just decided, fine, join the crowd, sort of work with, on top of that, with the things that I want to work with. And we see this with adoption curves throughout history, from cars to TVs to computers. Ostensibly, everything goes through a sigmoid curve. And I think what we're seeing now is potentially a split in that sigmoid curve as to how much of the systems are going to be individualized and how much are going to be, should we say, available to people so long as you use it in their way. Where are we talking about this? Mobile is ostensibly the battleground. There's not much point in developing anything these days that doesn't have a mobile use to it. I think I've been in about 5 cities in as many days now. There's no way I could have done that unless I was actually booking things as I go on the mobile. So I fully accept that that is the platform that we're really designing for, and that raises all sorts of interface issues, as I'm sure you're aware. We also have to look at the innovation. My partner and I work as chief innovation officers in our spare time, and we have to look at this continual cycle. So it's a question of where do you jump on board? So that neatly leads me into the hype cycle, the Gartner curve. When new technologies come out, they show such promise, and generally people are quite optimistic about them. Then reality bites, and they sink. But then gradually when they come back in a consolidated, reliable format that's useful. So I think whenever you're considering something that's new or integrating technologies, you need to see what the level of maturity is. To give you an example of this, if somebody came up to me now and said, hey, I've got this brilliant idea that I'm going to put PDFs on a web page, you'd sort of go, did that 30 years ago. You know, if somebody comes up to you and go, well, actually, we've structured linked open data using RDF, and this data set can be accessed through APIs, depending on the profile and the semantics that profile that individual, they go, that's got potential. So, you know, the reality is the world moves on. And it gets more fun, but also more chaotic. So why are we doing this? You know, Shakespeare basically said everything before I did. So, you know, if I don't know what to say, I'll go back to Shakespeare. The point is that people tend to be driven a little bit by greed in these things that say, hey, yeah, we could do this and then tomorrow we'll take over the world. And in fact, it's never really like that. It's always sort of going to find some equilibrium in the community, even with commercialism. However, the hyper-commercialism that we're seeing now means that some of the big leaders are going to be very, very hard for the smaller companies to compete with. So when you're building, you basically need to have protection in your system, obviously, build in AI, and from a practical point of view, the people need to see the ROI, they need to see what value is being added, whatever the technologies. We can come back into a bit more detail later. So how? I'm using Odoo 16 on the servers. I know 17's just out, I think, but I'm not going to go into that one because, well, it's too much back-end work. Because it's providing you data management platforms, the question then is, does it also meet the other requirements? In my sphere, that means a thing called HIPAA compliance, which is ostensibly ISO 27001. So, you know, not only do you have to meet the GDPR compliance, but you also have to make sure that you've got a couple of backup servers at least 4 kilometers away from the main servers and the rest of it. And that imposes certain sort of cost constraints, especially when you're talking about scaling issues with blockchain. Now, we come on to the core of what I was going to talk about, and to me, the whole thing about this digital identity, how do we actually work towards this concept of self-sovereign identity, which I can say in this country. The big issue to me is that I'm currently working somewhere where something like 90% of the population are expatriate, which means chances are most of them are not going to stay there, which means they also turn up with medical records from up to 197 different countries in various formats. We do have some standards like DICOM for imaging, there's FHIR, which is the standards for sort of data transfer. But ostensibly, most of the material we get is quite disparate. And how do we actually consolidate that and also make it available to them in a way that can then be used later on? So this is a brilliant book, if you've got time to read a book anymore, on self-sovereign identity, decentralized digital identities. What I'm emphasizing here is that when we're designing and developing new systems, we need to be thinking not just from the point of view of how we, as a central organization, will create spin-offs, but how those spin-offs could actually be used by individuals or small groups of individuals. You know, the 1, 2, 7, 15. I mean, you might just, I run one for the extended family. So, yeah, keep track of whether my daughter's paid the car insurance and that sort of thing. So from a practical point of view, we need to be using standard protocols. It doesn't exempt people, unless you have your own desert island, from still actually obeying the rules of the sovereign identity that's the one stamped on the front of your passport. So, yeah, at some point you're spot-welded back into the system. You know, I came across Eurotunnel last night, had to check my passport, you know, took me back 20 years. So it's quite nostalgic on one level, but in the practical level it means that, yes, these systems are running in parallel, and parallelism is a key point. I hinted at the fact that these are a few key traits, and I know I'm talking too much, so I'm just going to go through the headings. But we have to build redundancy into systems, especially for individuals. You know, 2-3 different routes to access information. Autonomy, ostensibly, I'm living in an environment where by 2027, all government services are intended to be fully autonomous and automated. So you basically manage yourself. That has certain advantages. It makes sure people do things legitimately. For example, you can't renew your car license unless you paid the fines that you've accrued for speeding in the last year. So, you know, sooner or later, life catches up with you. That sort of thing makes people autonomous and also gives them that sort of freedom to move forward. And the question is whether this is regulated or non-regulated. So as we're building in this resilience, I'm just going to sort of skip through some of these. The core to me is the ERC 725 protocol. I don't know if anyone's met Fabian Vorgesteller. He runs Luxor and was one of the original people who set this up with Ethereum, one of, I think, the 6 original developers. The point is that apart from being a very bright and very lovely guy, he's pushing for a concept of universal identities. And I think there's an awful lot to be said. The protocol basically splits into 2 parts. Your personal profile, which can link back to your state, your government, sovereign identity. So you've got the ability to have the KYC, AML, the validation, verification mechanisms, but also the non-fungible tokens associated with that. And with that, you can attach any identity. It could be the identity of this is me associated with my blood tests. It could be me associated with my hospital visits. It could be me associated with my insurance policy, without going into too much detail. The problem we have is we're living with a continuous beta. There are always going to be these innovation pathways. So what are the key standards that we have to adopt? We need to innovate because, yes, we have a grey tsunami. You know, something like half the population is going to be over 65. We also have this tech perfect storm, an awful lot more IoT devices, remote services, which COVID highlighted, and also wanting, as I suggested, patient-centered care. So to me, the innovation is an integral part of it, and I'm happy to share these slides later on, but basically, yeah, these are the main areas that you need to be covering to make sure your innovation is reliable. I hinted at the life science scale. What I would actually run that as one axis, and the other axis is NASA's technology readiness levels, so how far we're progressing through these. So effectively, we're creating a life science identity. It's your identity at these different levels, and then how we standardize that. So to some extent, this is the kind of modeling and advanced stuff we're going to have to cover. What I'm summarizing as the concept of this paradox, that we are hunters and gatherers at the same time. In the Middle Ages, it was known as insolubilia. I thought a bit of Latin, more Central Europe. The saying was, all Cretans are liars, I am a Cretan. And this was, you know, from sort of 2,500 years ago. You know, it's a paradox. How do you resolve it? Well, to some extent, this is a thing we can't resolve. What we do know is the majority of the population need bread and circuses, you know, sort of Panamit circenses. And most people don't care. Yeah, really, most people don't care what you're doing. They just want it to work. It's like, you know, if I press the car button to start it, I want it to start. I want to press the button for the window to come down. I'd also like to be able to look at an app and go, yeah, this has consolidated my records from all different sources in different formats. And no one person is going to be able to do this alone. So if you like, the call for action to run in parallel with the mainstream is, can we put together a group, a community who have an interest in decentralization, who have certain tools they're willing to share, that allows us to agree at least the de facto standards at this stage. I won't go too much into the ecosystem or the structure, but I do think it's important to try and turn this into what we call a non-zero-sum game, where everyone benefits. Otherwise, we're stuck in the competitive world where ultimately he who has the biggest resources is going to win. Okay, so any questions? No. Okay. Please.
Can you tell us a little bit about the latest development or the projects that you're working on?
So we have patient-related apps which are Odoo-based for tracking their pathway, their journey. I wrote a book in 2015 on bone and joint care paths. So basically, I was working in London, and half my population didn't really speak English, and so they kind of needed something as a prompt. The other half seemed to be lawyers. So, I wanted to make sure things were laid out really clearly, so, because I do see this participation and patient cooperation. If you're doing surgery, it's absolutely fundamental. You rely on trust both ways. So, as I'm seeing this move forward, those apps are developing in a way that will build in these other tools. So you can get the forecasting off the back of it for predicting, when the problems are going to be, when the workload's going to be. I happen to be part of an institutional review board for 17 hospitals. So we're at the stage of putting that into sort of clinical trials, working with the Department of Health. The Department of Health also has access to fantastic data for us to build the AI models for comparison. And so where we're heading is, coming back to those 5 Ps, what's my data, i.e. me, and where do I fit, once you've actually structured and consolidated the general population's data, so I can stratify it and sort of say, okay, I don't want to know what my risk of a heart attack is as a male in this country. I want to know what it is as a 57-year-old male with a weight of this and a height of that and this amount of exercise. So, I think this concept of moving towards personalized care is now possible and it's now doable, but we kind of need to get some at least de facto standards in place that we then work with. I was talking to MHRA, which is the regulatory agency in the UK, on Monday. And they're opening a thing called an AI airlock, which is basically a sandbox to those of us who are a bit more technical, which will allow us to test our AI systems against standardized data sets, partly to make sure they're not overfitting, which is one of the big problems, and also to speed up the process of regulation for when we build AI into this. So, don't see the regulators as those people who are about to beat us with a big stick. They're not. They're the people who want to work and collaborate with us to make sure we're competitive. Thank you. Okay.